After a quiet town, holler little girl walked up to repulent Jasmine Crockett and asked, "What does God mean to you?" No one in the room expected what happened next. People were already halfway to their cars. Folding chairs squeaked across the linoleum floors. Volunteers cleaned up the last row. The town hall in East Dallas had been quiet. Calm, nothing unusual, just another Sunday meeting where Rep. Jasmine Crockett had listened, explained, reassured. She was winding down, gathering her notes, her phone, her water bottle. Her assistant waved from across the room, mouthing, "Let's go." That's when she saw her, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, holding a faded children's Bible so tight it was almost folded in half. Her hair was in 2 slightly uneven braids, and the ends were tied with red plastic barrettes that clicked softly as she walked. She didn't look nervous, just focused, intent. She waited until she was right in front of Jasmine, lifted her head slowly and said, "Miss Jasmine, what does God mean to you?" For a second it felt like the lights dimmed. The air changed, not in some magical way, but in the way people stop moving when something real just happened. Jasmine blinked. She had been asked sincerity questions that day, about infrastructure, healthcare, even potholes, but none like this. She bent down slightly, enough to be eye level with the girl. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Alora," the girl replied. "My grandma said I could ask you anything." Jasmine smiled, a little caught off guard. "You can, and that's a big question." "I know," Alora said. "That's why I saved it for last." Something about the way she said it made Jasmine's throat tighten. This wasn't a child parroting a Sunday school curiosity. She wanted a real answer from a real person. Jasmine opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her mind wasn't racing with political language. There were no sound bites for this. No poll-tested answers, just silence, heavy, complicated silence. She slowly knelt down onto one knee. The floor was cold, and it reminded her suddenly of sitting on her mama's kitchen tile as a child, watching her mother cook, cry, pray. All in the same breath. Jasmine's voice came out quieter than she expected. "What does God mean to me?" She paused, again eyes flicking to the Bible in Alora's hands. "I think I used to think God was supposed to fix everything," Jasmine said, "when I was your age. I thought if I prayed hard enough, loud enough, God would make life easier. But he didn't, not the way I imagined." Alora didn't flinch. She just listened, the way only children do, when they know the person in front of them isn't pretending. "When I was around your age, I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, praying that my mum would stop crying after work." Jasmine continued, her voice trembling slightly. "She worked hard, still we never had enough. I thought if I could just be a good girl, keep my grades up, stay quiet, be helpful, maybe God would see us." She stopped for a moment, and a couple of people nearby who had been heading for the exit froze mid-step, now listening. "But sometimes you do all of that, and the lights still get cut off," she said, "and you start to wonder, did he not hear me? Or am I just not one of the ones he watches?" Her eyes began to sting, and she turned her head slightly to compose herself. She wasn't crying, not yet, but her chest felt tight, and the years she had buried deep beneath her professional surface were rising up. Alora looked down at her Bible. "But you still believe, don't you?" That question cut through her more than the first. "I do," Jasmine said quietly, "but not in the way I used to. God isn't some magic button. He's the thing that makes me get back up even when I don't want to. He's in the people who loved me when I had nothing. He's in you right now, asking me this." Tears formed at the edge of her lashes, but she didn't wipe them. Her hand reached for Alora's, and the girl didn't hesitate. She placed her small fingers into Jasmine's palm, like it had always belonged there. From the far end of the room, her assistant stopped. Walking, 2 reporters who had been packing up their cameras suddenly turned back on their equipment. One elderly man, who had been half asleep in the 3rd row, now sat upright, quietly watching. This wasn't part of the event, but somehow it became the only moment anyone would remember. But what made that moment hit so deeply was something most people there didn't know. Jasmine's relationship with faith had been cracked for years, long before her name ever appeared on a campaign sign, long before anyone stood in line to shake her hand or ask her opinion. Jasmine, Leona Crockett, was just another kid trying to survive in Monroe, Louisiana. Her world was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that smelled like fried bologna and bleach. Her mother, Bernadine, worked long shifts at the hospital cafeteria, her hair always pulled back in a scarf and her feet always aching. Jasmine learned early not to ask for too much. If the light bill got paid and dinner hit the table hot, that was enough. Faith back then lived in a shoebox under her mama's bed. It was full of church program, handwritten prayers, tithing envelopes with quarters taped inside, and a small torn paperback New Testament that had her grandmother's name scribbled on the inside cover. Bernadine didn't speak about God every day, but when she did, it was with weight, like he was someone she had loved, once fought with, and was still learning to trust again. Most nights Jasmine watched her mother sit at the edge of the bed with her head bowed, not in silence, but in something deeper, a kind of pleading that Jasmine could feel in her chest even if she didn't fully understand it. "Why do you pray so long?" Jasmine asked one night when she was 6. "Because some days," baby Bernadine said, lifting her eyes, "it's the only thing I can afford to do." Jasmine didn't ask again after that. Sundays were for church, not always by choice. They rode the bus to Zion Chapel, Missionary Baptist Church, a squat brick building with green carpet that smelled like old hymnals and lemon cleaner. Jasmine wore second-hand dresses with scratchy lace collars and sat with her legs swinging over the edge of the pew while the choir swayed under the ceiling fans. She liked the music, the voices, the rhythm, the clapping, but she didn't understand the sermons. Not yet. What stuck with her more were the whispered prayers of women like her mother, who didn't cry during service, but wept quietly when they thought no one could hear. Made her wonder if they believed so hard. Why did they still suffer so much? She asked. That once her Aunt Jo had overheard her and pulled her aside. Afterward, "Don't ever mistake struggle for punishment," she said. "God ain't Amazon Prime. You don't get to place an order and wait by the door still." Jasmine wasn't sure. The more she grew, the more questions formed. Why did her mom have to work on Christmas? Why did kids at school laugh at her shoes? Why did her neighbor, Miss Tilda, who praised Jesus louder than anyone, get evicted in the middle of a rainstorm? By the time Jasmine was 12, her belief wasn't gone, but it was quieter, less innocent, more cautious. But there was one night that carved itself deep into her memory. Her Uncle Ronnie had been in a car accident just outside Shreveport. The phone rang late, close to midnight. Her mother picked it up, and Jasmine remembered the sharp intake of breath, the way the receiver trembled against her cheek. They didn't have a car. So Bernadine called a friend from work to drive them the 2 hours to the hospital. Jasmine sat in the back seat with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. It was quiet, except for the static of the old radio and her mother whispering scripture under her breath. When they got to the ICU waiting room, the nurse told them Ronnie was in a coma. Visitors, no answer. Her mother didn't scream. She sat down, opened her torn New Testament, and started reading out loud. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she kept going that night. Jasmine watched something she couldn't explain. Her mother had no power, no money, no certainty. But she had that book and those words, and somehow that was enough to keep her from breaking. But not every storm had a quiet center, and Jasmine would learn that the hard way. Jasmine was 17 when she stopped praying. It wasn't some dramatic moment. No thunderclap, no slammed Bible or middle finger to the sky. Just silence. One night she laid down, looked up at the ceiling, and nothing came out. No words, no whisper, no reach. It started with her cousin. Daisiani was 23, funny, reckless, a little too confident for his own good. But he was the only one who ever told Jasmine she was smart enough to be more than a nurse or a secretary. "You're sharp, Jazz," he'd say. "You talk like you already got your own courtroom." That meant something coming from him. He used to walk her home from school when the older boys got weird, bought her spiral notebooks for debate club. When her mom couldn't, called her the next third, good Marshall with lip gloss. Then one day he didn't answer his Phone, they found his body 2 days later behind a gas station off E20 near Bossier City. Shot, twice, once in the back, no suspects, no real investigation, just a headline in the paper, and a couple of vague murmurs about wrong place, wrong time. Jasmine didn't cry at first. She sat on the porch in a metal chair, staring at the cracked sidewalk. The wind was warm, too. Warm, it didn't feel like grief weather. She remembered her mother saying softly, "We have to pray," but Jasmine didn't move for what she said. Her voice sharp, so they can write a poem at his funeral and forget about him by next week. "Watch your tone," her mother said, but even she sounded hollow. That night, Jasmine lay in her bed staring at the ceiling fan, spinning slowly. It should have been comforting it. Wasn't it felt stupid? She tried to start a prayer, just the opening, "Dear God," but her throat locked, her hands clenched the blanket instead. The words wouldn't come in the months that followed. Things shifted. Not on the outside. She was still in AP classes, still answering questions, still smiling when people looked, but inside something was caving in. Every time someone said he's in a better place, she wanted to scream. Every time someone told her God's plan, her chest tightened. What kind of God let good people get gunned down behind gas stations and then went silent? She started skipping church. Her mother didn't push. Maybe she understood. Maybe she was fighting her own storm. College applications became Jasmine's new escape. She poured herself into essays, paperwork, scholarships. She needed out, not just from Monroe, but from the version of herself that still clung to anything invisible. She got accepted to Southern University in Baton Rouge, pre-law, when the letter came. Her mother cried. Jasmine didn't. She packed her bags in silence. The first year was hard. New faces, new rules, long nights with no money and barely any sleep. But she liked the structure. The grind gave her something to push against. Faith didn't return. Not even close. If anything, the walls around it got thicker. She started dating. A guy named Landon was charming, older, full of ambition and opinions. They argued constantly about justice, about policy, about the world, but it made her feel alive until it didn't. The night he slapped her, it was quiet. No yelling, just a flash of anger, and his hand across her cheeks. He left before dawn, took a friend's couch for 2 weeks, didn't tell her mother. She stood in front of a mirror with a bruise under her eye and told herself, "This is not your story." That's when something shifted again. Not a return to God, but a return to herself. She stared at her reflection and whispered, "No one's coming to save you, so stand up." She did, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel empty, she didn't feel watched, but she felt something. It wasn't peace, it wasn't comfort, it was grit, and maybe that was enough for now. But grit alone wouldn't carry her through everything, and soon she'd face a kind of silence that no strength could quiet. Law school was a beast. No other way to say it. At Southern, Jasmine had been a standout. Professors knew her name. Classmates respected her hustle. But when she arrived at the University of California, Hastings in San Francisco, everything changed. It was colder, figuratively and literally. Nobody cared where she came from. Nobody clapped when she spoke. Her accent stood out. Her clothes looked too budget for the room, and the pressure it pressed on her chest, like a weight she couldn't shake. She kept her head down, took notes like her life depended on it, and pulled 18-hour days like they were nothing. But even when the work was solid, the loneliness hit harder. She was thousands of miles from her mama, from Monroe, from everything familiar. The city felt slick and fast, like a place always moving past her. Her bank account stayed red, and ramen became more than a joke. It was survival. There were nights she fell asleep in the library because her apartment was too cold and the heat had been cut off. Faith, no, she didn't have the space for that. She didn't have the patience for invisible comfort, and then came the phone call. It was a Thursday afternoon. Jasmine had just left a lecture on criminal procedure when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, she'd ignore it, but something made her stop and answer. "Is this Jasmine Crockett?" "Yes, this is San Francisco General. We have your mother here." Time collapsed. She was on a plane the next morning, red-eyed and holding herself together. With caffeine and clenched teeth, her mother had collapsed at work stress. They said overexertion, but beneath it all hypertension, years of pushing her body too hard for too little money, trying to make sure Jasmine never had to. The hospital room smelled sterile and dry. Her mother looked smaller in the bed, the IV in her arm a painful reminder that she wasn't invincible. Jasmine sat beside her, watching the monitors beep, gripping her hand gently. "I told you not to overdo it," she whispered, trying to sound firm, but her voice cracked on the last word. Bernadine smiled weakly. "You wouldn't be where you are if I didn't." Jasmine looked away. She couldn't hold her mother's eyes, not because of guilt, but because of something deeper, a question rising in her chest, ugly and real. "If you were watching us, why let her break trying to keep me whole?" She didn't say it out loud, but it burned behind her ribs. The next few days passed in a fog. Jasmine helped her mother get situated, set up a home nurse, and promised she'd finish law school no matter what. But the cracks were spreading. On the flight back to San Francisco, Jasmine sat by the window, clutching the armrest so tight her knuckles turned white. The woman beside her noticed her shaking. "You all right, honey?" the woman asked. Jasmine nodded. "Just a long week." The woman nodded slowly, and then did something Jasmine hadn't expected. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Sometimes," the woman said, "when I feel like the sky is about to crush me, I read this. My daughter gave it to me when she was dying." She handed Jasmine the paper and turned back to her magazine. Jasmine unfolded it. It was a verse, Isaiah 41:10, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." She stared at it, throat thick, not because it solved anything, not because it suddenly made her a believer again, but because someone else in their own storm had once needed it too and passed it on anyway. That small gesture, a stranger with a pain of her own, choosing to share her comfort with someone else, that stayed with Jasmine more than she expected, more than she wanted to admit. But healing doesn't always come as thunder. It comes in fragments, and Jasmine was still putting the pieces together. The years that followed weren't glamorous. They weren't filled with epiphanies or big declarations, just motion, one foot in front of the other. Jasmine graduated past the bar and started working as a public defender in Dallas. The pay was barely enough to scrape by, but it was honest. She walked into courtrooms full of men in suits who underestimated her and clients who didn't trust anyone in a blazer. She spoke plainly, fought hard, and carried every case home in her chest like bricks she couldn't put down. Faith didn't come roaring back. It didn't announce itself with light or clarity, but something began to shift. There was a woman named Miss Thelma, 64-year-old client, charged with shoplifting, caught taking bread, peanut butter, and cold medicine from a grocery store on MLK Boulevard. First offense, widow, lived alone, diabetes. Jasmine met her in a holding cell. The woman was trembling, ashamed, barely able to look up. "I wasn't stealing," Miss Thelma whispered. "I was surviving." Jasmine didn't reply right away. She just sat across from her, quiet, listening. That night she couldn't sleep, not because the case was complex, but because it reminded her of her mother's pantry, the kind of hunger people don't talk about in polite circles. She fought like hell for Miss Thelma's. Every technique, every inch of law. Charges dropped, case dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Thelma cried in her arms, "God sent you to me," the woman said, and Jasmine flinched. She hadn't heard someone say that to her in years. Not like that. Not with that much certainty. She didn't believe it, not fully, but she also didn't correct her over time. It started happening more. A mother at a shelter who hugged Jasmine so tight she couldn't breathe. A teenage boy she helped avoid jail, who later showed up with a job application and thanked her for believing. "Before I did, they didn't use scripture. They Didn't quote verses, but Jasmine started noticing patterns, these moments that weren't loud but felt placed, not orchestrated but intentional. Not miracles exactly, just right, like she was meant to be where she was, and slowly she began to pray again. Quietly. Nothing. Rehearsed. Sometimes. Just 3 words. Help me, God. Not with speeches, not with money, just enough to show up again tomorrow, to keep doing the work without losing herself in the process. Politics came later. She never planned on running. It was her mentor, Carleen Jefferson, who told her she had to. If we don't speak, they'll keep talking for us. Carleen had said, and they've been doing it for too long. Jasmine hesitated. She didn't want to be a soundbite. But when she looked at the neighborhoods left behind, schools with broken roofs, the women like her mother still folding hairnets for paychecks, too small to last the week, she couldn't walk away, so she ran, and she won. The pressure came instantly. The interviews, the criticism, the expectations from strangers who thought she should be louder, softer, angrier, quieter. But every time she stood behind a podium or in a hearing room, she found herself whispering the same words in her mind. Let me carry this right. It wasn't scripture, but it felt close, and sometimes, when she was alone in her office late at night, surrounded by papers and bills and unfinished thoughts, she would see her mother's New Testament on her desk. She kept it there, now worn, frayed, but present. Not because it had all the answers, but because it reminded her that answers weren't always the point sometimes. The only thing you can hold on to is the belief that showing up matters. That's speaking the truth, even when your voice shakes, is holy. But Jasmine still didn't expect that one question from a little girl would bring everything flooding back all at once. Back in that community center in East Dallas, the air held stillness. Jasmine was still kneeling, hand clasped in Alora's, as the girl looked up at her with eyes that asked for something deeper than fact or opinions. I think God means. Jasmine paused, the words catching again. She didn't want to preach. She wasn't here for that, but she also couldn't lie. He's not what I expected him to be, she finally said. Voice steadying, not a voice in the sky or a man on a throne, not someone who gives you what you want, when you want it. Alora blinked. So what is he? Jasmine took a deep breath. The room behind her was silent, even. The rustle of chairs had stopped. A few people had drifted back toward the center, their faces soft, expectant. These, the reason I didn't stay broken, she said. Even when I wanted to, even when I had every excuse to. Alora looked down at her Bible, then back up. I don't know if I believe yet, but I think I want to. That hit Jasmine like a punch to the chest. She smiled gently, one tear finally falling from her left eye. She didn't wipe it away. You don't have to decide now, Jasmine said softly. You just have to keep asking. The questions matter more than the answers. From the back of the room, a woman's voice cut through the silence. That's the realest thing I've ever heard a politician's say. A few people chuckled quietly. A man leaned on his cane, his eyes glacier. Younger woman near the wall whispered, I needed that. The moment had shifted. It was no longer Jasmine speaking to one child. It was something else, something communal, raw, human. Jasmine stood slowly, keeping Alora's hand in hers. She wasn't performing. He wasn't thinking about headlines or clips. She was thinking about the hospital room, the porch after Dizian died, the cold nights with unpaid bills and whispered prayers. She turned slightly toward the others who'd gathered. You know, she said, voice a little louder, when I first got into politics, people told me to keep faith out of my speeches. They said voters don't want to hear about God unless it's packaged a certain way. Safe smiling, a few nodded, others waited. But the truth is, she continued, faith isn't clean. It's not always church hats and choirs. Sometimes it's ugly, it's questions, doubts, silent nights where you ask, why did you let this happen, and no answer comes. Someone murmured, that's right, but the reason I still believe, Jasmine said, is because I've seen what happens when people choose love anyway, when they keep showing up, when they keep helping even when they're tired, and when they keep hoping even when it makes no sense. Alora squeezed her hand tighter. "That's what God means to me," Jasmine said. "Not someone who fixes everything, but someone who keeps us moving through it." Pause, no music, no fanfare, just breathe, and then the clapping started. It wasn't explosive, it wasn't planned, but it was real slow from the back, then the sides, then the middle. Not loud but firm. Jasmine looked down. Alora had tears in her eyes too, though she didn't cry. She reached into her little jacket pocket and pulled out a small sheet of paper. "I drew this in church last week," she said, "but I didn't know who it was for." She unfolded it carefully, a stick figure woman with a microphone behind her, a big sun, and the words "keep going." Jasmine took the drawing with both hands, her mouth open slightly, but no words came. Sometimes there were no words. She knelt again, hugged the girl, and whispered, "I'll keep this forever." But Jasmine didn't realize how far that moment would reach, until days later when a stranger brought it up in a place she never expected. 3 days later, Jasmine sat at a quiet cafe near Elm Street, trying to eat a late lunch while catching up on case files. Her schedule hadn't slowed down. Meetings, interviews, committee calls, she'd barely had time to breathe, but that little girl's voice still echoing. She kept Alora's drawing in the side pocket of her bag now, folded neatly inside a clear sleeve, so it wouldn't bend every time she pulled her laptop out. There it was, bright yellow, sung "keep going." She hadn't told anyone about the moment, not even her staff. It felt too personal, like something that didn't need editing or rephrasing. The waitress brought her iced tea and gave a polite smile. "You're Rep Crockett, right?" Jasmine nodded, a little wary me. "Granddad was at that town hall. The waitress said he called me crying." Jasmine froze. "He said he hadn't talked to God in 20 years. The woman continued, "Said he felt something in that room, said he finally understood what faith might look like if you're not sure anymore." Jasmine swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "I just thought you should know." The woman added, "What you said." "What?" that little girl asked. It mattered, and just like that. The moment wasn't small anymore. It wasn't just Jasmine and Alora and a quiet community center. It was rippling that night. Jasmine sat in her apartment with the lights off and the window cracked open. Dallas. Traffic hummed outside. Her mom's old New Testament was on the table beside her, the same one from under the bed. All those years ago, the corners were curled, the spine nearly split. Jasmine opened it to a random page and let her eyes land where they would. Proverbs 3-5, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." She stared at that sentence for a long time, not because it answered everything. It didn't, but it reminded her of something. She'd spent years running from. That faith wasn't about control. It wasn't about always knowing. It was about choosing deliberately, stubbornly to believe in the worth of trying again. She thought of her mother, praying quietly after 12-hour shifts. She thought of Dezine, full of dreams and gone too soon. She thought of Miss Thelma in that courtroom, thanking God through her tears. And she thought of Alora holding her Bible like it was armor, asking the question that politicians aren't supposed to answer, without a filter. What does God mean to, you know? She had an answer, not perfect, not polished, but real. He was the quiet force behind people who keep fighting, even when the fight is lonely. He was in the grit it takes to love others. When you're empty, he was in that little girl's bravery, asking something. Rowaned in her own willingness to feel whatever came after. Not every story needs a miracle, some just need a heartbeat and the courage to keep going. At her next town hall, Jasmine carried the drawing in her pocket. Someone asked her a question about housing reform, and she answered with precision. Another asked about crime, and she gave them statistics followed by policy. But toward the end, a woman stood up and said, "I brought my granddaughter. She wants to ask you something." The girl was maybe 9, hair in a bun of us. She walked up to the mic, voice trembling. "Do you think God listens when I cry?" Silence again. Familiar. Jasmine stepped from behind the table, moved toward the girl, and knelt. Just like before, she didn't quote scripture. She didn't give a speech. She said, "I think he listens, even when we don't know what to say." And the girl nodded, tears forming. Jasmine gave her a tissue, and just like that, another seed was planted. The older woman in the crowd clapped first, then another and another. Faith isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just someone choosing to speak truth. In a world full of noise sometimes, it's someone deciding that if even one child still dares to ask about God, we owe her an honest answer. So if you're watching this and wondering what faith is, it's not perfect, it's not pretty, it's not certain, but it shows up, and sometimes it shows up through you. If this story moved something in you, share it, leave a comment, and maybe ask someone close to you what faith means to them. You might be surprised what they say, and if you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories that matter.